Okay, if you remember yesterday, I skipped one slide, and it's a slide that is presenting another graphical method for assessing the performances of rainfall runoff models. And it's based on the comparison not just of the hydrograph, observed and simulated hydrograph, but observed and simulated flow duration curves. Therefore, I need to open a parenthesis on the definition of the flow duration curve, which probably you already know, because it's a well-known and basic graphical method to assess the availability of water resources. And it's also studied in the basic courses of hydrology, so I guess you already know it. But given that the flow duration curve is very much important for water resources management, I think we need to focus again on the definition in order to better understand what the flow duration curve means. And if you noted that I just said that the flow duration curve is an important graphical method to assess the availability of water resources. It means, therefore, that by comparing observed and simulated flow duration curves, we are, in a way, checking if water resources assessment through the rainfall runoff model is correct. And this is very important for us because, as you remember, we started to study rainfall runoff model because our purpose is assessment of water resources when observed data are not available. Therefore, it is very much important, this kind of check that we are now introducing, because it helps us to assess whether or not the model is indeed capable of reliably assessing water resources availability. Okay, so let's define the flow duration curve then, and let's focus on the blackboard now. And what is the flow duration curve? It's also called FDC, the acronym with which the flow duration curve is often indicated in the international literature is FDC, stands for, of course, flow duration curve. And the flow duration curve is a graphical representation that reports on the y-axis the river flow, and on the abscissa the duration. Let's be more precise. First of all, the flow duration curve refers to a cross-river section, okay, to a given location. And for that given location, it reports on the abscissa the time in which a given river flow was reached or overpassed. Again, it reports on the abscissa the time. I will be more precise later what I mean with time, but it reports on the abscissa the time in which a given river flow was reached or overpassed. Let me be more precise. Let's suppose that you have observed river flows in the given cross-river section by measuring mean daily river flows. This is a typical situation. You have observation, and these observations are collected at daily time step. And therefore we say that we have observation of mean daily river flow available. This definition is, anyway, you can extend it to the case of whatever time step, even if you have hourly data. But usually, when we talk about flow duration curve, we refer to duration expressed in days, because the typical situation is the one in which we observe the river flows at daily time step. Therefore, let's suppose that you have a long series of data, and let's suppose that for a given value of the river flow Q star, you count the average number of days in the year in which Q star, the river flow in the river, is equal or greater than Q star. Again, let's suppose that you have this daily observation, you fix a river flow Q star and you count the average number of days along the year in which the true river flow is equal or greater than Q star. And let's suppose that you get a duration that is equal to D star. Be careful, I said the average number of days in the year. It means that for every year of the observation period, you count in any year the number of days in which you reached or overpassed a given river flow Q star, and then you average over the years. And this means that in order to reliably obtain the flow duration curve, in principle you need observation for a sufficient number of years so that your computed average is meaningful. If you have just 1 year of observation, you can of course count the number of days in that year, but you can't count the average number of days. So you need, in principle, many years of observation, which usually you don't have. This is the reason why we use rainfall and off-course. Okay? Therefore, again, for every year you count the number of days in which you reached or overpassed Q star. You understand that this indication, D star, the duration of a given river flow is important, because let's suppose that you want to withdraw, you want to take an amount of water that is equal to Q star from the river. And you ask yourself, for how many days I can take this water? You can take the water only if the water in the river is equal or greater than the water that you want to take. Therefore, if your design river flow, your design withdrawal is Q star, the flow duration curve tells you that for D star days in the years, on average, you can get this water. This is important, because let's suppose that you design an aqueduct, a water supply system, and this information tells you that indeed for a duration D star, your water supply system can deliver the amount of water Q star, which is the design variable. And this is important because, of course, if you design an aqueduct and you want to get the amount Q star of water, it's important for you to know if you can deliver this water for 365 days a year or just 1 week a year. This is very much important. So you understand why the flow duration curve gives you an important information. Now, this graph can be drawn for many values of river flow, of course. And of course you expect that for high river flows, you arrive until the maximum expected river discharge. You can draw this graph within the limit 0, of course, no water in the river, and the upper limit is the maximum expected river discharge, which is not defined because there is no maximum for the river flow. It's not defined. Of course, conceptually you can define it, but you can't find a number because it's unlimited, the river flow for the maximum value. Therefore, you can start from the maximum expected value of river flow, and you expect that for higher values you get lower durations, of course. And so the curve, you expect a shape like this. And on the abscissal, the curve is limited between 0 and 365 if you are working with daily data. This is a yearly curve, so if you work with hourly data, of course, the maximum value of the abscissa is 365 times 24. This is a yearly curve. And if you use monthly data, the maximum abscissa is 12, of course. But usually, as I said, we work with daily data, so the maximum is 365. And in correspondence of the maximum value of the abscissa, you get the minimum flow on average along the river. So this is Q min. Again, I stress again the concept that if you want to draw the flow duration curve until a duration of 0, then the river flow tends to infinity. If you stop to 1 day, sometimes you see a representation where people takes as lower limit of the abscissa 1 day, because they are not interested in lower durations. Of course, if you stop to 1 day, you get a finite value of the river flow, which is the river flow that on average is reached or exceeded 1 day per year. But if you just allow the duration go down to 0, then the curve tends to infinity, in principle. Okay? So, just note that in this case, I assume that the minimum value of the river flow is greater than 0. If you are dealing with an ephemeral river, what in Italian is called a torrent, then you get the flow duration curve that is collapsing on the abscissa at a given duration, like in this way. Let's call this d prime, and the time interval between d prime and 365 gives an indication of the average number of days in which the river is without water, is dry. If you get the flow duration curve collapsing on the abscissa, again, and you indicate the duration of the collapsing point with d prime, the time span between d prime and 365 represent again the number of days on average in which the river is dry. The shape of the flow duration curve tells you a lot of information. Let me provide some examples. The shapes can be very different. Let me make 2 examples for the same value of Q min. You may have a shape like this one, or a shape like this one. These 2 shapes indicate two very different rivers. For the same value of Q max and Q min, these 2 shapes again indicate very different rivers. The lower curve is referred to a river where the high flows are there for a limited number of days in a year, on average. You see, the curve is rapidly converging to low flows. It means that you have a relatively limited number of days in which you have high flows. In the second case, instead, you have a slower convergence. It means that the number of days in which you have high flows is higher. Therefore, I would say that the lower curve is meaningful for a small river, a river with a torrential regime, where you have spiky high flows. So you have some flash floods that produce very high flows that last for a small number of days, and this is the typical behavior of a torrent. In the second case, instead, you have a river that once that it gets a flood, tends to keep the high value of the river discharge. If you have a slower convergence to the minimum flow, it means that the river keeps memory. So if a flood occurs, an high flow occurs, then the river tends to keep memory to slower down not so quickly. And this means that the river basin is probably more extended, because you well know that very big rivers, big catchments, large catchments tend to keep memory more than small catchments. So you may have similar values for the peak flow and the minimum flow. This generally does not happen, but in general you could have a situation in which you have two different rivers that have different catchment areas. They may have similar values for peak flow and low flows, but the river you expect from the larger catchment has a slower convergence to low flows. So this type of information tells you a lot. And okay, another information I was forgetting. An important information, the area that is below the flow duration curve, so the integral of the flow duration curve, this area here, represent the volume of water that flows through the river cross-section on average during the year. So the area below the flow duration curve represents the volume of water that flows across the cross-section on average in a year. And this is also important information, and you see that in these two cases, the upper curve has an higher volume of water, is characterized by a higher volume of water, even if the maximum and minimum flows are comparable, but of course, the slower convergence means higher water volumes. Now, it remains to inspect how to compute the flow duration curve. So let's refer to the very simple situation in which you have the data, the observed data. So let's suppose that you have a long series of daily river flows, and let's now specify how to compute the flow duration curve. Let's refer for the first example to the very simple and not recommendable case in which you have just 1 year of data. I'm just making reference to this case because it's very simple, and then we will extend to the typical case of more years of data. So let's suppose that you have just 1 year of data. It's very simple to compute the flow duration curve for that year, which is not an average flow duration curve, it's just the flow duration curve for the given year. And it's very simple. If you have your observation, like QT, and when I say QT, I mean that the observations are ordered in chronological order. So you have from the 1st of January to 31st of December, you have your observation here. This is your time series, which you take from the National Hydrographic Service or from the annals, hydrographic annals. You get this series, and let's suppose that you put it in Excel. Then you can build here on the right the series Q that you get if you sort this series in descending order. You order the series starting from the higher value to the lower value. So you get again the same numbers but ordered in this way. So this is the highest, and this is the lowest. And now let's suppose that you put here ascending index from 1 to 365. You just put an index here in increasing order from 1 to 365. You have just 1 year of data, so you have 365 numbers. And then you already got your flow duration curve, because if you draw a graph taking the index as abscissa and the ordered flows in the ordinates, then you get the flow duration curve. You see the highest value of river flow has duration 1, the lowest value has duration 365. That's it. And you got the flow duration curve. But of course you have more than 1 year, so you can repeat this computation for every year, and you get for, let's say, 10 years, your 10 flow duration curves. And you can now draw a graph with all the curves, okay? Let's suppose that you get something like this. For every year you have your curve. Okay, so in order to compute the average curve, you simply can, for any duration, in this case, if you compute the curve in this way, you get your duration starting from 1, not from 0. Okay, so we should put 1. Because if you compute the curve for any year, of course you start from 1. You get, for each year, the highest flow in the year that has duration 1 day. So you start your overall graph from the abscissa 1, but then for each duration you can compute the average value of the related flows. You average these curves and then you get your average curve. Like so. Or better, like so. Yeah. It's not possible to distinguish the color, but I think you understood what I mean. So very simply you compute the average. Or there is another possible solution. In applying this approach, you have the disadvantage that you always start your flow duration curve from 1, so you don't get any estimate for duration that are lower than 1. And this is a limitation. Because if you think about your series, let's suppose that you have 10 years of data. Indeed, you have the means for computing the river flow for durations that are lower than 1. Because if you think about the highest value in your 10-year series, the highest value was reached only once in 10 years. So it's a duration that is lower than 1. It's 1 over 10. It's 1 over 10 days. I hope you understand the concept. So you have the means, if you have 10 years of data, to compute the river flow for a duration that is lower than 1 day, because the highest value, I say again, the highest value in 10 years has a duration of 1 over 10 days. So you would have the means, but you are not using this type of information. You are starting from 1. You have no way of using it if you apply this method. But the advantage of this method is that beside the computation of the mean curve, you have the opportunity to compute what are called confidence limits. I try to be clearer. You have an opportunity to compute the uncertainty, the variability. Because it's intuitive, it's quite obvious that if you see over this graph that all the curves are close to the mean, you feel much more comfortable. You say, okay, every year I don't have situations which are very far from the mean. Instead, if you see a situation like this, you get a bit concerned because you realize that you may have years with in which you get much less water than expected, much less water than the mean, and the years in which you get much more water with respect to the mean. So you get a bit concerned because if you are designing a water supply system, you are concerned by years in which you get a situation that is far from average, because you design your supply system by referring to the average. So every time that you get far from the average, either because you have a lower amount or greater amount of water, you get in a difficult situation. If you have too much water because you can get your works damaged. Or in any case, you can't use it, because if you design the water supply system on the average, if you get more than the average, you can't get this water, because your pipes can't deliver more water than the design variable. And conversely, if you get low flows, of course you are concerned, because you have people downstream waiting for water and you can't deliver it. So, going back to the main concept, you have an opportunity to see uncertainty, to see variability in this way. And to quantify this variability, uncertainty, we usually compute what we call confidence limits or confidence bands. Namely, we estimate an average around the mean value. Sorry, not an average. We estimate a range around the mean value, an interval, an upper and lower limit for this average curve. Like in this case, I can draw an upper curve like this, and the lower curve like this, in order to identify a range where I expect much of the individual curves of each year to fall. I say again, I can estimate a range around the mean curve within which I am expecting that many and many individual curves of each year are falling. What does it mean, many and many? If you say all the curves, of course, you have to draw what is called an envelope curve. So a range that encompasses all the curves. In this case, you say all. Okay? But of course, you have just 10 years of data, or 20 or 30, but in any case, you cannot be sure that you get all the possible curves during this observation period. And therefore, you can't really say, you can't be really sure that all the curves fall inside the range that you have drawn. You may say that all the observed curves so far fell into this range, but you can't be sure about the future. So usually the way in which we define this range, we define the probability with which we expect the curves falling into the range. I'm not going into the detail because I don't want to anticipate the concept of probability and statistics now. We will deal with this concept later on. But I think you can understand that if I say I expect that 95% of the years my flow duration curve is falling into this range, I think you understand the concept. It means that if I try for 100 years, for 95 years I really get the curve that is falling into this range. So this is an estimate of uncertainty, of variability. Okay, so going back to the main concept, this method for computing the flow duration curve has the disadvantage of starting from 1, and has the advantage of allowing us to estimate uncertainty, to estimate this range that I mentioned to you. Okay, that's fine. Now, there is a second method that you can apply to estimate the flow duration curve if you have more than 1 year of data, as you would expect. So let's again refer to a situation in which you have 10 years of data. It means that if you ignore the leap years, this is steady, it means that you have 3,650 observations now. Okay? Therefore, I can write again in an Excel column these 3,650 observations, just one in chronological order. So not just for 1 year. This column is extended to the full observation period, in this case, let's say 10 years. Okay? And then let's again sort the data from the highest to the lowest Please remember that the difference with respect to before is that now I have all the data here in these columns. So 3000, again 650. And then let's now, again, create a column with the index, which is extended until 3650. Now, let's create one more column with, let's say that this is the index. Let's create one more column, which is the index divided by n, where n is the number of years along the observation period, in this case 10. Okay, there you have this second column, which is starting from 1 over 10 and is extended until 365. And then you can draw a curve which has in abscissa this index divided by n, and along the ordinates the ordered observations from 1 to 3650. Okay, so you get a curve. Let me delete this one, these ones. You get a curve that starts from, first point is 1 over 10, 1 over n, and last point is 365, so you start from here and you get here, and for each day you have 10 points, not 1. So the curve is drawn with an higher definition. So the curve is drawn with a higher definition, and you have the advantage of the higher definition itself. And the advantage to compute, to estimate the curve for a duration that is lower than 1 day. You have the disadvantage that you cannot estimate uncertainty. Okay, I think at this point you well remember what is a full duration curve, and let's now go back, if we are successful in turning again the projector on, to the picture that I showed you yesterday, and let's remember the original problem, which is, of course, checking the reliability of a Rank-Farnoff model, and I anticipated that one of the methods that we can apply is comparing observed and simulated flow duration curves. So you just create a graph, and for a given validation period, and you put in the graph the observed curve versus the simulated one. And of course this test allows you to check if the model is successful in reproducing both the low and high flows. And as I said, this check is particularly meaningful when you have to check if the model is good in assessing water resources availability. Okay. I cannot show you the picture again, but it was a very simple picture that was showing not just a comparison, but instead a series of flow duration curves estimated, and therefore I think that I just plotted the different shapes of flow duration curve on the blackboard, so it doesn't matter if we don't see this slide. Let me let me emphasize that this example, this test, clearly shows to you that you have an opportunity through rainfall runoff modeling to assess the availability of water resources. This is, of course, showing that indeed rainfall runoff models can be used to this purpose, and therefore an alternative for estimating the flow duration curve if you don't have any data is, of course, rainfall runoff modeling. I just want to mention what the alternatives are to estimate this curve if you don't have data. One possible alternative is just simulating the data with the rainfall runoff model and apply these estimation methods on simulated data rather than observed ones. So this is a first opportunity. A second opportunity, which I want to mention, the second opportunity that I want to mention is related to other procedures for estimating the flow duration curve that are based on regional methods. So let me be more precise. These curves can be estimated also in absence of any data by using what are called the regional models, and the regional models basically identify flow duration curves that are valid for a given geographical region. Meaning that if you have in a region, geographical region, a series of watersheds, if you have a series of watersheds, let's say that you are working on this region, and in this region you have some rivers,